Hey everyone, it's Mike. It's Saturday, September 18th, 2021. And with this video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the content in the new version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears. This is the update that came out on September 9th, so just a little over a week ago. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because I was reading through it and looking at some footnotes, and it points back to something that I presented back in 2018 in my presentation, The Beatles, Paul McCartney, and The Grand Illusion. And it was very, very interesting for me to see the connection. But in any case, you can see I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book, and I'm reading the footnotes first. I'm doing it in reverse order. Tom highly recommends you read the narrative first and then the footnotes, but because I'm familiar with the book, I figured I'll read the footnotes first. So you can see I dog-eared many of the pages. These are all pages that contain footnotes, and where you see the colored tabs, those are pages with footnotes that I consider to be significant and important. Okay, so but before we get into the book and what I want to talk about here, I want to thank everybody for their continued support, their kind words, the feedback, the great comments. It's very, very much appreciated. The show I did with Ofer is pushing almost 11,000 views. And the show I did with Steve and the team on the Standing Stone Part 4 is also around 11,000. And the recent video I put up that was looking into whether Patrick McKenzie, the ghostwriter from the famous Groupies website, Kirkcaldy McKenzie's grandfather, was actually Greg Masters, that's done well, and there were a lot of really, really great comments. And something I should have mentioned that I forgot to talk about in that video is that it's possible that Greg Masters was also ghostwriting for the Beatles, not just for Billy, not just for, in all likelihood, ELO and other bands, but for the Beatles as well, because he was right there along that entire timeline. And he left Idle Race in 1972. Jeff Lynne left in 1970. And that lines up very nicely with when Billy started up Wings. So in any case, again, thank you everybody for all of your support. It's greatly appreciated. So let me now move to what I want to talk about in the Memoirs of Billy Shears. If I go to page 15, there is some interesting bolded out letters. But let me read it first and I'll take you through it. Suddenly, they were thrown sideways into a pole. So when Billy and Tom are talking about they are referring to Paul McCartney and the lady hitchhiker that he picked up. That's how the story goes. Her name was Donna, as we're told in the book. So they were thrown sideways into a pole, which, like a, quote, silver hammer, that, quote, came down upon his head, made sure that he was dead. And then in parens, Maxwell's silver hammer. Hardly a day ever passed without Paul discussing one of his horrific nightmares. Finally, Vernon E. Mosher, one of Kenneth Anger's Satanists, let me flip the page here, met the Beatles on May 11th, the last day of filming Help. Interpreting Paul's dreams, Mosher said, "They mean that you're the one, you're the goat, the band's sacrifice. When did you make your compact with Satan?" Measuring Paul's life, Mosher crunched some numbers, then read Paul's palm for validation. He said, "You have about 15 more months, kid." Okay, so there's a lot going on in just those two paragraphs. But let me just point you to the bottom of page 15. Now, you're going to see bolded out letters. For those that are not familiar with the bolded out letters, let me just close this blind here for a second because I think this is interfering with the light. Okay, there we go. The bolded out letters, that's called word stacking. So the way Memoirs works, it's written in layers. The first layer would be just reading the book the way you would read any book, just read the words. The second layer would be the word stacking. So when you read the bolded out letters, it forms sentences that tell you more about the story. And then the third layer is the acrostical code. Okay? And there's also another layer that I call it a layer. And that's where there are little clues in Memoirs that they're dropped, but then it's up to you as the researcher to go outside of Memoirs to do further investigation and further research. This is what happened to me when I did my presentation on whether the Beatles wrote all their own music. It's not spelled out, or at least in the version that I had at the time of Memoirs, it was not spelled out that the Beatles did not write all their own music, but there were little subtle clues, and I think it was on page 350 and page 351 of the previous version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, and I picked up on it, and it had to do with Dr. Coleman and the Committee of 300 and Tavistock and Theodore Adorno and so on. And so that's what sent me off to go do further research. So to me, that's the fourth layer. Okay? Anyway, going back to page 15. So we could see at the bottom of page 15, I highlighted some words and a letter. And the words that I highlighted is Maxwell, Knight, and Quay, because they're bolded out. So if we move the K up, we get Maxwell Knight. Well, who's Maxwell Knight? Maxwell Knight was a British spymaster who was with MI5, and I'm going to take you through his Wikipedia entry in a moment so we can learn a little bit more about him and his background. But here's the thing. Back in my presentation in 2018, The Beatles, Paul McCartney, and The Grand Illusion, I presented some slides that were relaying some information that I received from a source who told me that they were at some soiree back in the 1990s, and the people who attended this get-together were military-industrial types, intelligence, and Silicon Valley technology. And during that get-together, there was a small group of these guys that were talking, and the person who wrote me said that there was one person in particular that was talking about the topic of Paul McCartney and then discussed what happened and said that the car crash was something that was manufactured. They, meaning the deep state, forced the car crash, they ran him off the road, to ensure there was an accident to kill him. And if the car crash did not take Paul out, then these guys do what they do. In other words, they were going to make sure that he did not leave that scene alive. They were going to ensure that he died. And when I did that presentation, I just presented it because this is what the source told me, and at the time it was just, hey, here's a possible scenario. And so I found it very interesting that now in Memoirs, Tom highlighted Maxwell Knight. In the previous version of Memoirs, Maxwell and Knight were not highlighted. They were not bolded out. So it made it, I guess, not as obvious to pick up on it. It was there, but by bolding it this time, Tom is making sure that people see this. Now, what does this mean, really? Does it mean that Maxwell Knight, the Spymaster, the British MI5 agent, was directly involved in ensuring the death of Paul McCartney, the murder of Paul McCartney? Or was he leading a team that was involved? Or is it telling us that the British government, the British deep state, was involved? That I don't know. And the reason why I'm not just pointing to Maxwell Knight and saying, oh, he's the guy, is because Maxwell Knight was having a lot of health issues from about 1956-57 through when he died in 1968 from heart failure. So let me take you to his Wikipedia entry so I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. So I'll be right back. Okay, so here's the Wikipedia entry for Maxwell Knight, and it says that Charles Henry Maxwell Knight, OBE, known as Maxwell Knight, was born on July 9th, 1900 and died on January 27th, 1968, was a British spymaster, naturalist, and broadcaster, reputedly a model for the James Bond character M. He played major roles in surveillance of an early British fascist party as well as the main Communist Party. And I'll leave a link down below so you can read through all this. I'm not going to go through it all, but We can read about his career in the military, his career with MI5, and down here, when he was working for BBC Radio, so isn't that interesting, a spymaster, and then he winds up in the media. It says here that Knight conducted his broadcasting career alongside his work in intelligence until 1956, when he retired early from MI5 on the grounds of ill health suffering from angina. So angina, also known as angina pectoris, is chest pain or pressure usually due to insufficient blood flow to the heart muscle. And then when we get down to his personal life and death, it tells us that he died from heart failure on January 24th, 1968. So when Bio Paul died in September of 1966, Maxwell Knight would have been 66 years old. 66 and 66. It's a little weird, right? But what I'm calling into question is his ability to be directly involved in the hit if he was suffering from ill health. So that's why I said, could it be that he was directly involved, or was he heading up a team that was responsible for making sure that Paul died in that car crash? Or is Tom and Billy telling us through the persona of Maxwell Knight that the British deep state was involved in making sure that Paul McCartney died on September 11th, 1966? Okay, that's why I called it into question. It says here, when he retired early from MI5. I met a guy who was with the NSA a long time ago. Well, his career with the NSA was a long time ago. I spoke to him about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And he told me that when you retire from an alphabet agency, in this case MI5, you never actually ever retire. Okay, so I want to point that out as well. But again, the thing I'm calling into play here is his health, and if he had heart conditions, was he in a position, health-wise, to be able to be involved in something like this? Maybe he was. And again, I will leave the link down in the description box below, and you can read some more. Okay, so with that, now I'm going to switch over to 2 footnotes in Memoirs that are attached to this. So hold on one second. Okay, so I'm back, and this comes from page 367 of the new Memoirs, and the chapter is titled More Satanic Murders. And I want to give a shout out to Wendy because she pointed me to these 2 footnotes earlier on. I had not made my way that far through the book. I think Wendy's about done with it. I'm thinking, by the way, of getting some of my colleagues together once we finish the book to do another roundtable to talk about all of the new information. But in any case, let me read this footnote to you, put my readers on. And Tom has this note. Countering claims that Paul's death was not valid according to code, it was explained that the crash leading to Paul's death was only as accidental as the one that killed Diana, Princess of Wales. After the crash, bang bang, the agent that caused Paul to crash made sure that he was dead, and then in parens again, Maxwell's silver hammer. Diana's death counted, and Paul's certainly did too. The pronouncement, enactments, and all else occurred according to the ancient code. The offering was complete. Osiris was sent to find Horus. Now, before I go any further, I should explain that the footnotes, the new footnotes, many of them take us deeper into the Egyptian mysteries, and specifically with regard to Osiris and Horus. And what the footnotes tell us is that the controllers, the cultic elite, those that sit in the pyramid of power, their spiritual and philosophical ideology is deeply, deeply embedded in the Egyptian mysteries. And they are playing out, in essence, prophecy from those mysteries. That's what I've gathered so far from reading the footnotes. And that biological Paul and Billy are playing out the Osiris and Horus characters. Or some people might not even refer to them as characters. I know that there are people that believe that they were actual gods. So this gets to be very, very intriguing. And for a lot of people, it's going to be very, very difficult to get their heads wrapped around. There is a fanaticism, a fundamentalism that the controllers have with Egypt and the Egyptian mysteries. And, by the way, Crowley, or Crowley, depending upon how you want to say his name, because all of Alice's work goes back to the Egyptian mysteries as well. His Aeon or Eon of Horus, the Age of Horus. This is what is playing out right now. Okay, so, and one of the things I wanted to do was to put a presentation together to connect all the dots with regard to Osiris and Horus and the Egyptian mysteries and Crowley, and to do a presentation on it. I don't know when I'm going to get around to do that. I have all of these great ideas about presentations I'm going to do. Some of them I'm able to get to, others just sit on the shelf on the back burner until I can get to them. But that one I do believe I am going to do. But again, I don't have any time frames right now. So that was a footnote on page 367. And then there's a footnote on page 461. And again, Wendy pointed me to this one as well. And we all know the backstory, especially if you read Memoirs, that Billy tells us that Paul left the studio in a huff, upset, because he was given song assignments by Brian Epstein. And the number of songs that Brian had given to biological Paul, I guess, was something that Paul considered to be too many for the amount of time or the amount of runway that he had to get those songs written. Now, let me just pause for a second, okay? As you all know, through my research, my position is that the Beatles, especially from the 1962 through 1966 period, wrote very little of the music during that time period. Most of that music, the vast majority of the music from 1962 through 1966 was written by professional songwriters with George Martin and Theodore Adorno heading up or overseeing that process. Now, some people will ask me, now, Mike, are you saying that John and Paul and maybe George wrote no music during that 62 through 66 period? I believe if they came in with a song, they had to run that song by George Martin. They had to show it to him. And then George Martin would take the concept of that song. Maybe it's the message that biological Paul or John Lennon that they were trying to convey, and that was turned over to a professional songwriter. So maybe they came in with a concept, and then that concept, if it was acceptable by George Martin, would then be played out by having professional songwriters put the song together. Okay, that's what I believe happened between 1962 and 1966. So in essence, they really didn't write any of the music during that time period. That's my position on it. From 1967 through 1970, as I've mentioned in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? My position is that more of their original music started to come through, and they were also playing on more of the recorded tracks. I also do not subscribe that between 62 and 66 that the Beatles had the skills or the chops to be on the recorded tracks. Those songs during that period were recorded by session musicians. It was the Wrecking Crew model that was being used. That model, the Wrecking Crew model, was used throughout all music, pop music, in the 1960s and the 1970s. And starting in the 1980s, what happened was a lot of these session musicians, these ringers, they actually formed bands, and they were the band members. So that's why we see less of the Wrecking Crew model from 1980 going forward. But even though the Wrecking Crew model was not as prominent from 1980 to current day, these bands and these artists are still using session musicians on their recorded albums. Watch the documentary Hired Gun. Watch that. And that talks to the 1980 through current day recording process and how it works and who's really playing on those records. In fact, one example they give is Aerosmith. And there are Aerosmith records, recorded tracks that Joe Perry did not play on. They had a professional session guitarist come in and do those guitar tracks that were credited, or at least people were led to believe, were played by Joe Perry. And when Joe played live, he was taught how to play those particular riffs. Now again, I'm not picking on Joe Perry or anybody else. I'm just trying to explain how this works in the music industry. Okay, so I know I'm digressing here. Watch the Wrecking Crew documentary. It's on YouTube. And also watch Hired Gun. And I think Hired Gun is on Amazon Prime. If you watch those two documentaries, you will have a very, very good understanding of how the recording process works in music and how it's done. Okay, so in any case, let me go back to the footnote on page 461. So again, the backdrop on this is the story that Paul didn't like the number of song assignments he received and the runway in which he was given to get these songs written. And again, I don't believe he wrote any of those songs, but that's the story, okay? So the footnote says that the slamming door was Brian, not Paul's. So Tom is telling us in the footnote that the door slamming, that was not Paul. That was Brian Epstein. According to the agreed-upon cover story, Paul died from reckless driving after an argument at EMI late that night. And that's the story I just told you. However, Paul was not at the studio that night. He already died earlier that morning. The purpose of the cover story was to make the death appear to be accidental. Now, we talked about this ritual sacrifice and the sacrifice being covered up as an accident in the recent show that I did with Steve Faulber and the team. In that particular presentation, it was broken up into two parts. The first part was the standing stone, and the second part we talked about occult symbolism and ritual sacrifice that takes place in the music industry, the entertainment industry, Hollywood, and so on. And during that show, I had said that what happens is that these ritual sacrifices take place. Somebody is killed, murdered, taken out, and then a story goes out and says it was a car accident, it was a drug overdose, it was a suicide. And the two examples that we talked about during that show was Brian Jones, who was the ritual sacrifice for the Rolling Stones. The official narrative, the story is that Brian drowned in his pool, even though Brian was a very good swimmer. And one of Brian's girlfriends is still trying to open up the investigation, to reopen up the investigation into his death, because she said there's no way that Brian drowned in the pool because he was a very good swimmer. in Memoirs, Billy tells us through Tom that it was a death for success situation. In other words, it was a murder, it was a ritual sacrifice, and that's why Brian Jones died. The other example that we talked about during the show was Kurt Cobain. And we are told that Kurt Cobain killed himself. It was a suicide. However, there was a private investigator that was involved in that case that actually started by working for Courtney Love. And as he got more into investigating, he started having a lot of doubts about Courtney Love. And he started to piece together what he believed happened. And he believed that Kurt Cobain was murdered and that the crime scene was set up to make it look like a suicide. And the documentary, if you want to watch that one, is Soaked in Bleach. I finally remembered the title of the documentary. Usually I forget. And when I talk to Steve about it, he has to remind me the name of the documentary. But that's a very good documentary. In that documentary, the private investigator has a ton of recorded conversations with Courtney Love, and it's very, very weird. And there's something really, really off about that whole thing. Okay, but again, to go back to the point I was making is these ritual sacrifices, these murders take place as part of an occult ritual. And then the public is told it's a car accident, it's a suicide, it's a drug overdose, stuff like that. But in reality, it's none of that. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to take you through that footnote as well, because this all ties back into what I presented back in 2018 as a possible scenario based upon what a source came forward and told me. So, and as I was reading this, I was like, holy smokes. So maybe, I was right 3 years ago. But in any case, I also want to talk a little bit about, let me get to that footnote. Now, in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? I had had a segment that talked to how some of these songs may have come about. And Yesterday and Hey Jude, but I'm going to focus on Yesterday because in my documentary, I laid it up against an old Neapolitan song which sounded exactly like the melody to Yesterday. And in my presentation, I said that based upon that evidence, that Yesterday was not written by Paul McCartney, that song already existed, and that it was reworked into Yesterday. And I had put forward the possibility that people like George Martin, who would have been very familiar with these old Neapolitan songs, was involved in getting that song reworked and then getting biological Paul McCartney to sing it. And of course, the story is that the song came to Paul in a dream. So let's read the footnote on page 17. But before I get there, let me just also say that in other presentations, I talked about the Ashers, and in particular, Richard Asher, and how he was tied into psychology and hypnosis and potentially mind control. And so this footnote comes out in this edition, the new edition of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, and I'll read it to you. And I've also said that I have suspected for a long time that biological Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and maybe even George Harrison and Ringo Starr, but I usually focus on John and Paul were in mind control programs from a very early age, and that the backstory that we're given, the official backstory about their lives, is mostly fictional. I don't believe those stories are true. That's not to say they don't have threads of truth going through it, but the overall narrative, I believe, is a fictional account. It's a story. Okay? Anyway. So, in this footnote, Tom is saying that George Martin encouraged Paul's relationship with the Asher family. Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend, is Richard and Margaret Asher's daughter. For Paul, they set up a special bedroom with a piano. Margaret was one of George Martin's music professors when he studied piano and oboe at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. Richard, an eminent endocrinologist and hematologist, experimented with hypnotism to cure various medical and psychological conditions. On February 11, 1956, the British Medical Journal published Dr. Asher's paper, Respectable Hypnosis, consisting of his lectures that showcased his remarkable success with various hypnotic experiments. Richard occasionally hypnotized Paul to further Paul's success and to ease anxiety. Purportedly, George, and Tom is referring to George Martin, secretly provided Margaret with Yesterday, based on Nat King Cole's cover of Answer Me, Love Me, to use as an experiment on Paul. Over a series of hypnotic sessions, when Richard had Paul in a state of high suggestibility, Margaret repeatedly played the song on the piano while Richard instructed Paul to recall it, but not the source, when he awoke. So, that footnote covers two aspects that I have suspected. Number one is that biological Paul did not write Yesterday. We can see here that it was done through trance. And also that biological Paul was participating in a mind control program. Because that's what is going on here. If this footnote is true, that's what's going on. So you can see how deep, and I always say this, how deep this rabbit hole goes. It goes very, very deep. In any case, I'm going to leave you with a clip from Frank Zappa, who talks to us about how John Lennon ripped off one of his songs. So I'll leave you with that. You guys have a great weekend, and we will talk soon.
Can you describe how John Lennon came to perform with you at the Fillmore?
No problem. A journalist knocked on my door at a hotel called 1 Fifth Avenue at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of that show, and he was waiting there at the door. This man writes for the Village Voice. He was waiting there at the door with a tape recorder in his hand, and I just crawled out of bed, my hair sticking out all over the place, and my eyes were twirling like that. 2 o'clock in the afternoon is very early to wake up if you played 2 shows in a night. And he says, "Hi, Frank, I'd like to introduce you to John Lennon." And he was, sticking the mic at me like, "Oh, I'm going to go eek," or something like that. So I said, "Okay, come in." And the first thing he said to me is, "You're not as ugly as I thought you'd be," which leads me to wonder about the strength of his glasses, because I'm as ugly as I ever was. I'm just as ugly now as I was then. And it's a great credit to Mr. Lennon that he wasn't shocked by all of this. So he came in, and we talked for a few minutes, and I asked him whether he wanted to play with us at the concert at the Fillmore East that night, and he did. And we just happened to have a recording truck there because we were recording the shows for another purpose, and the tapes were made. Now here's the bad part. During the performance, when Lennon was on stage with Yoko, we played one of my songs called King Kong. And the deal that was made, according to the usage of the tapes, was he got to use the tapes for his purpose, I got to use the tapes for my purpose. He released part of that performance on an album called Sometime in New York, and changed the name of the song King Kong to Jam Rag, and gave himself and Yoko writing and publishing credit on the song. Now obviously this song has a melody and chord changes. Somebody did write it, and it was not them. So, whoops.
Ooh. Did you ever do anything about it?
Not yet.
It's so hard not to laugh.
Go ahead and laugh. What's the difference? See what MTV does to you? You can't laugh. You have to sit there and take this stuff seriously. Give yourself and the audience a break. Would you? I mean, Are we to assume that MTV really is an extension of the Warner Brothers mentality? It is, isn't it? Come on, be honest. It's that corporate Warner Brothers, come on, we're sort of out there in the valley kind of mentality, isn't it?
There's no doubt about it.
I know it.
They may call it rock and roll, but it's corporate America.
That's right. It's push the button, pull the chain, out comes the little brown choo-choo train.